Welcome back to Lifespan Development. We are ready to dive into the topic of early adulthood, chapter 9 from your textbook. And so for this part of our class, we're going to be talking about the process of becoming an adult and what that looks like and why it looks that way. We'll talk about the physical development, relationships, sexuality, gender roles, falling in love, and work. Those are all huge cornerstones for this section of our lives. So let us start off with the idea of emerging adulthood. And I know I've mentioned this in class before, but we're going to define emerging adulthood as transition from adolescence to adulthood that includes exploration and experimentation. And so for American culture, this is typically between the ages of 18 and 25. But remember, as we've discussed, this is a cultural construct, right? It used to be that you went straight from being a child to being an adult. There was no time for exploration. There really was no time for experimentation. There was just expectation. And so this is where we are today, in today's culture. And so when we're talking about the different types of experiences that people are having, we're looking at physical experiences, intellectual growth, as well as emotional experiences and growth. There's very little structure that guides us, but there are patterns that we follow, and of course that's what's really big in lifespan studies. So if we start off with this idea of adulthood, you'll notice that there are patterns in every culture that say when somebody is officially an adult. And at this point, being an adult means having courage, being independent, being in control of yourself, and really no longer having the dependency on other people, especially your parents. And so most cultures mark this moment with an initiation rite. And in your textbooks, if you turn to page 208 and 209, there's a table at the bottom of 208, table 9.1, and it shows you all of the different types of rites of passage that people go through. I mean, we have educational rites of passage, religious rites of passage, social, of course, rites of passage. And this could be a bar mitzvah, or it could be a bunch of tribal boys sticking their hands into gloves full of stinging ants. It very much depends on what the culture believes is going to establish those three things: the courage, the independence, and the self-control. On page 209, they actually go into some of the rites of passage, or the initiation rites, that we see across many different cultures, and that's really interesting to take a look at, so I highly recommend checking out that page. This does, of course, bring about the discussion of hazing, and hazing is something that happens quite a bit in American culture, and really the focus of research has started to look at this because of the problems that it's created. But we define hazing as the practice of initiating individuals into group membership through arduous and demeaning tasks. And sure, there's always been a history of wanting to, put the new guy through some kind of hell that you yourself have perceived you've gone through. It doesn't mean you necessarily have, but you thought you did. But it just seems to be getting worse, and we especially see this in the United States with fraternities especially, but also sororities to a certain extent. And we can trace back the origin to all kinds of different sources, but we do know that this is pretty much a cultural universal, that we celebrate adulthood and emerging into adulthood everywhere around the world. An important question for psychologists is, why do we go through this stuff? Why do we put ourselves through these things just for this label of adult? Because let's face it, we're going to be an adult no matter what. This last bullet point that I have on the slide, ascribed versus achieved identity, kind of hits on that idea. So achieved identity means that it's something that we've fought for, as opposed to something that's just been ascribed to us by society. So if you're talking to a 25-year-old, then they've probably been ascribed the identity of an adult because of their age, but it doesn't mean that they've necessarily achieved identity. They may still be living with their parents may be doing their laundry and cooking for them. So we like to see a combination of both of these in American culture to consider somebody a full-fledged adult. So let's talk a little bit about the physical development that we see in this stage. It definitely slows down from this point forward. Height is usually set, and the average for females by 18 years old, they aren't going to grow any taller, and by 20 for males, they're pretty much set. During this period, we tend to see a weight gain of about 15 pounds for both males and females. It's interesting because we associate that so much with the freshman 15 of people going to college, but it turns out it doesn't matter if people are going to college or not. There's still typically a weight gain of 15 pounds. The brains and organs at this stage are going to be at their maximum potential, which is why it's so important to focus on getting things to go smoothly, or as smoothly as they can in this period, so that middle adulthood and late adulthood can go equally as well. So if we consider the biopsychosocial approach, first considering biological, a major focus in this realm of our lives is reproduction, right? This is when we are at our highest capacity for reproduction, both in drive and physical ability. We know that men and women, of course, reach their sexual peaks at different times, but the earlier that men and women are having children, usually the better it is for both the mother, the father, and the child. Psychologically, the individual is becoming responsible for themselves, and that can be a lot to take, and sometimes people break under that pressure. Socially, we are assuming the roles that society has said, hey, this is what an adult does, right? These are the responsibilities. It always reminds me of the movie Step Brothers, where you have two grown men who are living at home with their parents. And by grown men, I mean 39 and 40. And they do not assume the adult roles at all, but their parents are really trying to force them into it because, let's face it, it's time, right? That's their ascribed status. So socially, we're supposed to be doing things that are labeled adult-like. The peak of good health is written here more because everything about our bodies is in the best shape it's going to be. And that can be a really good thing or a bad thing. We call this the organ reserve. And so what that means is that we have this functional capacity that's on reserve. So the total capacity of our organs that we don't usually use is there, ready, and waiting to be used. But that reserve is going to decrease as we get older, right? And so our heart becomes a little less functioning, our lungs have to work harder, our kidneys have to work harder. So when we find ourselves maybe not feeling well or exercising or whatever it is, at this stage, we're able to really tap into a lot of reserves to get the most out of our body. But the older we get, the less we have to tap from. Biologically, this means we have some limits, right, that become established. But psychologically, we see people persevering beyond these limits. You watch people who run marathons or, any type of great physical act, and you have to know that there's a level of perseverance that's happening there. Recently, there was a man who allegedly survived, being stranded on a boat for, oh goodness, it was a very long time. It was like 100+ days. And his friend that was on the boat with him died. And the question is, how could somebody survive something like that? And while his body was really focusing on reserves, psychologically, that perseverance kicks in and keeps people going. Socially, there's also the aspect of pressure, right? And what is it that your peers want you to be doing? What is it that your family and your coworkers and your boss expect from you? What you can see from this point forward is that after the age of 30, you see a 1% decrease in organ functioning every single year. And that's pretty much for everyone. You might see a slight delay in that decrease in the super healthy. And I know we talk about this every week, but diet and nutrition, of course, play a really big part. And so there's this the sensation of feeling healthy. And it doesn't mean that we actually are being healthy, but it leads us to make poor choices. And so if you feel like you don't get sick very often, you're satisfied for the most part with your body and your energy, then you would say that you're a healthy person maybe. But that wouldn't stop you from eating McDonald's every other day for lunch, right? So that can be misleading in our choices. Now, a lot of our nutrition in early adulthood is actually dictated by our nutritional choices as children. That's why it's so important to encourage kids to eat well and make good choices in their foods, because that really sticks with us. The beginnings of heart disease and high cholesterol really start to accumulate at this point, especially as our lifestyles get more fast-paced and we become less active. Cancer is fairly unlikely in this stage, but again, we're going to see this stage be a little bit more susceptible to cancer than, say, adolescence, right? And that risk increases with each stage now as we move towards the elderly. We have media that's influencing a lot of our choices in diet and nutrition. Right now the fad is kind of going gluten-free, and gluten-free is really important for people with celiac disease, but that's become a huge health trend, and you'll notice walking through the grocery store that everything now has these huge labels that say gluten-free on things that never had gluten in them to begin with. I noticed that yesterday at the grocery store with hummus. Now my hummus is labeled gluten-free, but there was never hummus in it before. You'll see it in certain types of alcohol that never had it, or even shampoos or toothpastes. And those types of things shape our ideas about what we should be doing and what's appropriate. We have a lot of social influences in this stage. I think I probably ate the worst over my freshman year of college because all of my friends were eating terrible, terrible food, right? And it was social time, so it was really easy to say, no, I'm not going to make a good choice. I'll have what you're having. Physical fitness is important in this stage, so we have the social and the physical, right? This idea that being physically fit helps you in your social life, both because you feel better, but also because you feel good about yourself and you have more energy. And then the added physical component keeps your body where it needs to be, and so that allows us to have a better psychological well-being. But finding time is really, really tough, especially in this stage. I mean, you're trying to balance these new responsibilities, and maybe you're in college, or maybe you've got a new job, or raising a family, you've got relationships, you've got friends, social time you're trying to find. And so that becomes the number one reason that people in this stage don't exercise, is because they just can't find the time. Doing exercise in this stage, though, will reduce the risk for all of the major life complications, and it helps increase life expectancy. Of course, much better than you would see somebody who starts exercising in their midlife, right? Starting in this stage would extend life far further. One of the biggest threats to health in this stage is substance use and abuse. This is in part a problem because you have new responsibility. You also have things that you've been told you shouldn't have for a long time. And so once it becomes more accessible, people may be more likely to abuse it. So binge drinking is definitely happening in this stage. And we define binge drinking for men as 5 drinks in an hour, and for women it's 4 drinks in an hour. And people tend to know that binge drinking is a bad idea. When researchers have gone out and surveyed early adult populations, they have said, we know binge drinking is bad. But of course, they continue to do it. These are your percentage rates. 18 to 20-year-olds, 33.7% admit to binge drinking regularly. And then in that 21 to 25, I find this interesting because this would be the group that would be out of college, it's actually at 46%, so an even higher rate. And I'll let you ponder why that would be. Smoking is another major issue in this stage. It is the leading preventable cause of death in the United States. It kills more than alcoholism, AIDS, drugs, murder, car accidents, suicide, and fires combined. Okay, that's how big of a deal this is. But there are also plenty of studies out there that show that individuals who smoke are going to be less athletic, right? Probably because their lung capacity just can't handle it. They're going to be more social. A lot of people are social smokers. They study less because they spend more time smoking and being social. So if they're studying less, they have lower grades. They're also more likely to have a more negative attitude towards school. And that may be something that's also being reinforced in their social groups too. Rape and sexual harassment is another huge threat in this stage of life. This is a very pertinent topic, and we know college-aged women are far more likely than any other age group of women to be raped or sexually harassed. The current estimation is that 1 in 4 women experience rape, but most don't report. So it's hard to really know what that number is. Could be higher, could be lower. But that's probably fairly accurate. The biggest way to combat and or help a woman cope with these situations is to provide them with a really safe environment where they feel supported and where they can feel healthy. And that's healthy socially, psychologically, and biologically. We do know there are long-term repercussions to becoming a victim of rape and sexual harassment, and this can influence the lifespan development. And those two are substance abuse and mental illness, depression, and anxiety for very logical reasons. With cognitive development, early adults now have all of this life experience behind them, and so it's time to fuel all of those experiences into education and college, and you're trying to choose your life path. And of course not everybody goes off to college, but it's still trying to use what you know and know about yourself to figure out where should you head. So of course with cognitive discussions we're looking at theory. And so Piaget had informed on this idea post-formal thought. Now remember, Piaget stopped his stages as into basically late childhood, and so this isn't Piaget's actual idea, but they used Piaget in the creation of this particular cognitive stage. And so this was a little bit more flexible and less absolute than Piaget. And it was all about what's relative, right? So individuals are going to be more aware and more intelligent about things that are pertinent to them. This is what allows people to be able to contemplate religion, politics, love, as well as the emotions they're experiencing. And all this is going to be really important for social interactions, as well as development of self-esteem. We start to see intellectual and ethical development come full circle here. Some are kind of caught up in this idea of dualism, right? Things are right or they're wrong. And uncertainty is not a bad thing here because uncertainty can lead to diversified ideas. But for many, they start in this place of dualism. Then we move into relativism. And this is the understanding that what's right or wrong is situational, right? Completely based on the circumstances. And from there we move into commitment. And these commitments mean that we've explored the implications and we recognize our decision based on our own identity and our ideas of our identity. And so if you consider any controversial idea, whether or not marijuana should be legalized, whether or not abortion should be legalized, all those types of things, people work through these 3 stages to get to commitment. And we've talked about this with adolescence. Now it becomes really firm. Gender and sexuality is, of course, another really big part, especially for those who are going off to the 4-year college experience, because all of a sudden you have men and women who are interacting with very little supervision and a lot of pent-up tension that's developed over their adolescence. So when we look at men versus women, we start off with sexual identity, how one thinks of oneself in terms of sexual and romantic attraction linked to genetic traits and physical characteristics of male and female. So at this point, we tend to find that males and females are a little bit more comfortable in expressing their sexual identity, even if they don't actually know what it is, right? And that's where we start to hear ideas of experimentation. But a lot of times we confuse this concept of sexual identity with gender role. And gender role is defined as expected behavioral traits associated with men and women in a given society. And so these are two very separate things. I'll never forget the first semester I taught lifespan development. One of my students was like, oh, so sexual identity and gender role coming together are kind of like someone being a lug. I said, what is a lug? They said L-U-G. I said, that still means nothing to me. What is a lug? I said, lesbian until graduation. And I hadn't heard that particular term before, but I was familiar with the stereotype that, girls go to college and they experiment with their sexual identity before settling into their gender role that determines that their permanent sexual identity will be heterosexual. But isn't it cool that they're lesbians in college? There's a lot of cultural aspects of sexual identity and gender role, but we just socially have a very hard time with separating these two out, even individually. The confusion is fed by a lot of different things. The media plays a huge role in this, as far as setting up like our stereotypes and our expectations, but also just kind of hitting on what we're already hearing from maybe friends and family. I think of the movie Superbad, where it's all about these two guys getting laid before they go off to college. It was based on what the writers actually went through getting ready to go off to college. But we have real life that's going into media, but then how many people is that particular movie influencing? So we start to reflect and we start to define based on what we're seeing around us, and that's what's going to lead to confusion. But we want to accept our sexual identity, and so by the time we reach college, a lot of people have accepted their sexual identity. Again, even if they haven't settled into what their sexual identity means. But we do see a lot of rejection of gender roles that's happening here, where people are starting to exist more on a continuum as opposed to really rigid gender roles like we've seen traditionally. And so the trends have changed pretty drastically over the last couple of decades. If we look at evolution, we know that history has created a lot of biological predispositions, meaning that men and women were born biologically as they were, but the cultural distinctions, the social norms that we've placed on people over really long periods of time have led to what are now biological predispositions. And so these gender roles that we've seen, like if you look at the Flintstones, right, you have the Wilma, who's the very traditional female cave woman. You've got Fred, who's the very, very traditional caveman. And there are still remnants of those ideas in our society today. And that's because they're functional, right? This division of labor and this division of, emotions and socialness and all of those things. It serves a function. It doesn't mean it does it well or that it's right, but it's just always been that way. It also doesn't mean it always has to be that way. But we certainly link our expectations to the biological abilities of males and females. Androgyny is kind of an interesting topic in this stage. We have people who are extremely masculine or extremely feminine, think something like Jersey Shore. But we know that individuals who are on the end of the spectrum there, who are super masculine or super feminine, tend to be more neurotic, they tend to be more anxious, and they tend to have lower self-esteem. What's interesting, if you look at the same individuals in high school who were hyper-masculine or hyper-feminine, they didn't have these same traits. They were not as neurotic, they were not as anxious, and they actually had quite high self-esteem. But all of a sudden we transition into early adulthood, and those things flip-flop. Now we have the idea of androgyny, and this is the expression of both roles, okay? So we're looking at feminine gender roles being taken up by males and vice versa. It also tends to be quite situational. But individuals are encouraged to be more creative, and they're better at acting instinctively when they are androgynous because they're not being bound by their traditional gender roles. Now let's talk about sex. It's actually happening less frequently than it has been over the last couple of decades, and we know early adults are having fewer partners than they used to, and that tends to surprise a lot of people. We kind of have this expectation that people today are so influenced by the media that they're just out having sex all the time with all kinds of strangers. But the trends are moving in a downward, I wouldn't say a downward spiral, but certainly a downward direction. We do see people using more contraception than ever. Part of that is related to just being more informed and having those resources. But the other part of it is people are starting to really make the connection with needing to wait to have kids in order to not spend their lives bogged down by debt and limited choices. Of course, we have to visit the topic of sexually transmitted infections with this stage. We do know that HIV rates are down. However, other STIs, herpes, gonorrhea, chlamydia, all of those are actually up. And so we're seeing people take certain methods of protection to heart, but not all of them. Another trend that's surfaced over the last couple of years has been Pact Dating, where individuals start, seeing people within their large group of friends because, somebody else is an acquaintance, so people can vouch for each other, and it just seems like a safer way to go. You know people's history. Our social developments, we really start to secure our sense of self. We are much more able to relate to others, right? That's something that we kind of struggle with as teenagers. And so one of the theoretical ideas here is individuation, where we have a separate and special personality apart from the adults who have been influencing our lives, right? Those parents and those teachers. And so this is all behavior driven. If I want a boss to see me as somebody who's independent and responsible and a good choice to hire, then I need to develop that personality that's separate from the reliant one that was, looking to parents and looking to teachers. This definitely tends to be easier for men and harder for women, in large part because of the way we socialize males and females. And we talked about this over the last 2 chapters, but we socialize males to be more independent, to be more individuated, whereas we impress upon women the need for that social connection and nurturing and relying on each other. And that's what makes that so much more difficult. Now, Levinson is the one who came up with this idea, and he really believed that the separation in our personality didn't happen until a crisis appeared, right? Like we're on the brink of poverty and we have to get a job, or our first love is going to leave us, or whatever it might be. But he felt like a crisis had to happen in order for individuation to be there. And that's what allows, hopes and dreams to be established, because now we know what's important to us and where we want to go. And so this really allows us to gear up for the transition into not necessarily middle age, but moving more towards 30 and being a little bit more older and refined. Intimacy versus isolation is related to Erikson. Remember, Erikson always is looking at the two dualities. And so in Erikson's words, this is the ability to relate one's deepest hopes and fears to another person and to accept another's need for intimacy in return. And so this is our goal. This is what we should socially be looking for. And if we're not successful, then we'll be isolated. And so in order to achieve this, Erikson said that we have to commit, even though it involves sacrifice and compromise on our parts, maybe something that we're not even really familiar with, right? Especially as teenagers, sacrifice and compromise, what are you talking about? The need for either, whether it be intimacy or isolation, is ever changing in this stage, right? We're going into early adulthood kind of wanting some isolation and intimacy at the same time, and then it vacillates back and forth between those. And intimacy, keep in mind, is not all about sex, right? Intimacy can be between friends as well. And so let's talk about friendship for a moment. We form more friendships in this stage of life than we do at any other time of our lives, especially friendships that are lasting. We know that having friends is vital to who we are, right? They inform upon us, and using Charles Horton Cooley's Looking Glass Self, they help us to figure out who we are, because they reflect who we are or who we think we are. It is our friends that allow us to venture outside of our comfort zone and explore what we like and what we don't like. But friendship in this stage is important because we choose these friends, right? If you think back to your friends when you were in elementary school, middle school, high school, you're friends with these people because these are the people who are around you. But when you're in college, when you start looking at a career, the people that you surround yourself with, you have said, I like hanging out with you over all these other people that I've been forced to be around all of my life. And maybe I do like them, but I still choose you at this moment. And so that's what lends itself well to long-term relationships with these friends. We have friendships in flux here, and in part because friendship kind of ebbs and flows with our relationships, right? As we meet maybe our life partners, or we come across challenges in friendships. They can come and go, but we tend to hold on to friends from this stage better than at any other point in our life. Now we talk about love. Sternberg is one of our psychologists who we've looked at previously, and we'll be covering him a little bit more in the future. He liked to study love, and he said that individuals had one of these 5 types of love stories going in their relationship, and I love these. These are perfect. So he said you either had a travel love story, meaning you looked at your relationship like it was a journey, right? With challenges, with rewards, but oh, isn't it amazing? Or you could have a gardening love story where you believe that your relationship needs tending, meaning everybody has to work hard to make this come out into something beautiful. The horror love story is when you get excitement from scaring a partner, right? So these are much more likely to be your very abusive relationships that people just keep going back to. And then we have the business love stories, where you have a good partnership is the important aspect to both of these partners. So they want equality. They want to complement each other. They bring a certain amount of balance to each other's lives, and they both benefit from that relationship. And then the last love story, of course, is pornography, where really nothing else matters except for sexual satisfaction. So I'll let you consider what type of love stories you've experienced, and of course, what love story you hope to experience. But Sternberg, in studying love, came up with this triangle, which is pretty widely revered these days. And so he said that most couples have one aspect of the pyramid, or actually the triangle. So we have intimacy up at the top, we have commitment down on the bottom, and then passion opposite of that. And he said a lot of couples end up having one or maybe even 2 of these, right? You could have intimacy and commitment, which would give you what's in the middle there, companionate love. Or you could have intimacy and passion, and that would give you romantic love. But he said the goal for a long-term relationship, a marriage, someone you want to spend your life with, should be what's in the center, consummate love, full of passion, full of intimacy, and full of commitment. And so once a relationship has these 3 things, then the likelihood it will stay together for a lifetime is much, much higher. Now, another aspect of our relationships, both with friends and with lovers, is validation. We don't necessarily know that our perceptions are the same as others, and so being around other individuals gives us the reality check that we need. You can imagine you put something on in the morning and you think, well, I think I look good in this, but I don't know, maybe I don't. And you walk out and people are either going to go, oh yeah, you look really nice in that. They're not going to care, or they're going to tell you that that was a horrible choice. You need to go home right now and change, right? And so it helps us to have the perception of others. Validation is defined in our text as reciprocal sharing of deep secrets and feelings that allow people to feel loved and accepted. This is such an important component of human life, right? This ability to feel loved and accepted, but we can't get total love or total acceptance unless there's a reciprocal sharing that's happening. And so once we've achieved the intimacy with an individual and we've experienced this love, we've validated our identity and who we are. And that's just a huge portion of our own sanity, right? This is essential to our sanity. It's about taking risk. And, we're getting love from these sources of validation, but this also helps us to understand the pain when a friendship or a relationship ends, because our identity is called to question, and the reality checks and the reciprocal sharing and all of those things are very abruptly over. So now that we've talked about that, let's talk about marriage and family. Marriage, for a long time in American culture, marked adulthood, right? It was this idea that once you got married, you were officially an adult. And for a long time, that happened straight out of high school, right? High school prom, then you got married, then you had babies. And so let's talk about some of the marital practices. This is actually a picture of my very own grandparents from their wedding way back when. And they had, the very traditional wedding. And they were married straight out of high school. And in fact, they had a secret wedding first, straight out of high school. And then once they felt that people would be okay, about 6 months later, they had a big public wedding. And that's what this picture is from. We know that 95% of people, just people in general, end up marrying, right, in the United States. The average age for women is at 25 years old. The average age for men is at 27 years old. These are two of the highest ages that we've seen as far as trends in the United States, because it did used to be so much earlier. We see marriage happening typically at the stage of early adulthood, and the views of marrying young have deeply changed, right? We have more of an emphasis on education, more of an emphasis on, finding ourselves and establishing a career and all of those types of things. But that has also led to an increase in cohabitation, which a lot of the population is split on, right? A lot of people think that that's a bad idea, that that's living in sin, that it goes against our religious backgrounds, but it's still in a lot of ways a good choice for couples who want to delay making that level of commitment until they are completely feeling like adults themselves. So that leads us into family, right? Because that's the order we go in the United States. We go from marriage to family. So the average American family has 3.2 people, usually, 2 parents, 1 child, or 1 adult and 2 children. But the average, if you look at women in the United States, the average number of births they have is now 2, compared to 4 at the beginning of the 1900s. 54% of all American adults are married and living with their spouse. So I find this interesting because 95% of us will get married, but at any one time, 54% of us are married and actually living with the person that we married. 30% of all children under 18 live with a single parent, and 84% of those single parents are female. Probably nothing surprising there. But in a lot of ways, we expect that children will bring happiness to us. But that's not always been the purpose of children. For a long time, we had children because we needed children to help us make money, right? You had more kids to help you work on the farm because the more workers you had, the more money you made. And so that's been a real shift in our consciousness, and that has been one of the reasons why we've seen more of a push for the stage of adolescence and emerging into adulthood. This, of course, brings about the topic of divorce. And so from 1960 to 1980, the divorce rate in the United States has tripled. By and large, this is because of divorce laws themselves, not because more people wanted to get divorced, because it became easier for people to get divorced over the course of the 1960s. Because we saw more people wanting to get divorced, social acceptance kind of gradually has been gained over this time frame. And it doesn't mean that divorce is any more acceptable, and is certainly, if you look at couples who are walking down the aisle today, if you ask them, hey, what's the chance you're going to get a divorce? Everybody's going to say, well, there's no chance we're going to get divorced. We're going to be one of those that lasts forever. But then we know that the divorce rate's right there around 50%, has been hovering there for some time now. And we don't judge people the same way we used to. There's also been a lowering of costs for divorce. It used to cost so much money to get divorced, and oftentimes only men could afford that because women were working in the homes, and so they didn't have an actual income that was separate from their husbands that they were trying to divorce. So they were virtually stuck because they couldn't afford to do anything different. And so by lowering the cost of that, we've seen a big change in divorce. And the last part of this is more related to the independence of women. Women realizing that they didn't have to get married, they didn't have to have children in order to be happy and successful. And so that's increased the social acceptance and has led more women to leave their marriages so that they can be independent and enjoy, who they are. Here's a crazy chart for you. We know that attitudes vary about marriage and divorce, but what we don't often consider is how those attitudes might impact our relationships. And so the chart in your book is obviously a little outdated. State laws for marriages between same-sex couples, the light gray is prohibited, and the bluish color means that that's where gay marriage is legal. And so we now have, I think it's 18 or 19 states that legally recognize same-sex marriage, so definitely a few more than we see on that top chart. But if you look at the map on the bottom, states that allow marriage between first cousins still outweighs the number of states that same-sex relationships are recognized in. And this chart has just always blown me away because it seems to be such a culturally well-known idea that you shouldn't marry your cousin, right? That's basically incest. But at the same time, we have states with more laws that allow that than homosexual relationships. And that just tells us so much about the environment that we're living in today. Let's talk about work for a little bit because, like I said, we're talking about college and marriage, and of course we need to be considering careers here. So with career planning, most freshmen are going to enter into college with a major already chosen. That's really building in high school an idea of what do you want to be. And then we find that sophomores, once they're sophomores, they start to explore other choices, they start to firm up their decisions, and for juniors, they should basically be totally settled and seeking opportunities. But it is oftentimes sophomores who are changing their major after they've gone through gen ed classes and decided on something that's a little bit different. But our choice in career is going to relate to our personal values, right? And that all comes back to our identity. Now, our work identity is very closely tied into our self-identity. Depending on the types of financial opportunities that we're looking for, the type of people we like to work around, how we spend our leisure time, and the types of arrangements we make for living. So if we don't achieve these values, right, then we put ourselves at psychological risk if our work identity doesn't match our self-identity. These are those circumstances when people just absolutely hate their jobs. And you know that happens frequently. Now, research is showing that one of the best ways for us to reduce that psychological risk is to provide mentors so that individuals can kind of see what their career path looks like and then what these 4 areas end up turning out for people who follow that career path. We also should be considering dual career families. This has been a pretty major shift in trends related to families in this stage. Because like I said, traditionally it was, a man and a woman who got married super early. They had a bunch of kids super early. The woman stayed at home taking care of the kids, and the man was out earning the money. Nowadays, we have a much higher percentage of families who have both parents who are out working in the workforce. In fact, I think the most recent number I've seen has been as high as 70 or 75% of families are dual career earners. And so we've put more women into the workforce, and while that brings about a higher stress for women because they're balancing home care, child care, and work, it also gives them a deeper sense of personal satisfaction as opposed to just staying home and taking care of the kids. The choices people make in dual career families are going to reflect the family needs, right? And so a lot of times it's economically driven, that we need 2 incomes in order to support what the family needs. But we've also seen women make a lot of changes in the type of work that they're doing, way more than we ever see with men. And so men tend to pick a career path and stick with it, whereas women bounce back and forth between the types of work they do, oftentimes to accommodate what the family needs. Paternal child care is a shifting trend. We're starting to see more stay-at-home dads and more working moms, although there's still a little bit of stigma around that and certainly a lot of stereotyping that surrounds it. But it is kind of an interesting trend to watch for, and we have to really consider both the nature and the nurture side of why our gender roles have dictated what they have up until this point for men and women staying home. All right, that is it for our topic on early adulthood. Stay tuned. Next time I see you, we'll be talking about middle adulthood. Okay.